Welcome back, guys. Today we're diving deep into the world of ancient Rome and uncovering some truly disturbing facts you might not know. Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. It's always fascinating. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back in time to ancient Rome. Roman toilets. At first glance, Roman toilets seemed clever. Stone seats were built side by side, and water flowed beneath them to carry waste away. It looked advanced for the time, but this system hid deadly risks. People sat close together, shoulder to shoulder. There were no walls, no privacy, and the air was thick with the unbearable smell of waste. But the real horror waited below. Deep in the dark sewage tunnels, rats thrived. These weren't harmless creatures. They often crawled back up through the toilet holes, sometimes biting or attacking people who were sitting there, trapped and helpless. And that wasn't the only danger. Methane gas built up inside the sewers from the waste. This invisible gas was extremely flammable. Sometimes, people brought torches into the dark toilet rooms to see better. One small spark could ignite the gas and cause deadly explosions. There are recorded stories of people being blown apart or burned alive while simply using the toilet. But even without rats or explosions, many Romans feared the toilets for another reason: the supernatural. Strange noises, sudden illnesses, and deaths were blamed on evil spirits or demons said to live in the sewers. To protect themselves, Romans carved protective symbols near toilet seats or whispered prayers before sitting down, hoping to avoid becoming the spirit's next victim. In the end, Roman toilets were far from safe. They were dangerous, disgusting, and terrifying. Rats, deadly gas, diseases, and dark legends turned a simple daily need into a deadly gamble, where every visit could be your last. Vespasian's urine tax. In Rome, nothing was wasted, not even urine. And under Emperor Vespasian, not even that was free. During his reign, Rome faced financial strain after costly wars. Vespasian needed money, and he didn't care where it came from. So he created a tax so disgusting, so humiliating, that it became infamous across the empire: the urine tax. Public urinals, known as Fulonicae, collected urine from ordinary citizens. But this wasn't for sanitation. Urine was highly valuable in Roman industry. Fullers, who cleaned and whitened wool clothing, used its ammonia-rich properties to remove stains and soften fabrics. In other words, Roman workers literally cleaned clothes with other people's waste. Vespasian saw opportunity. He imposed a tax on the collection and sale of urine. Business owners and workers had no choice but to pay for what people freely discarded. The urine tax became so well known that even Vespasian's own son, Titus, mocked him for it. But Vespasian was cold and ruthless. Holding a coin earned from the tax, he famously said, "Money does not stink." It became a cruel symbol of Roman greed. To the empire, it didn't matter if wealth came from gold, blood, or urine. All that mattered was power. The people's waste became the emperor's treasure. Even in filth, Rome found a way to profit, proving that in this empire, dignity and shame were luxuries only the rich could afford. Upside down. Crucifixion. Crucifixion alone was already one of the most agonizing deaths in ancient Rome. But when the Romans wanted to make it even worse, when they wanted to turn death into humiliation, they flipped the cross upside down. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't common. It was saved for moments when punishment wasn't enough, when the victim needed to be broken not just in body, but in soul. Nailed through their hands and feet like all crucifixion victims, those hung upside down faced new horrors. Blood rushed instantly to the head, creating unbearable pressure. Within minutes, their vision blurred, their face swelled, and their head felt as if it would burst. Breathing, already difficult during normal crucifixion, became nearly impossible. The victims suffocated slowly, their chest compressing under their own weight, unable to push up for relief like in normal crucifixion. Their brain pounded, their eyes bulged, and the taste of iron filled their mouth as blood vessels ruptured silently inside. But the Romans didn't only do this for the added pain. They did it for shame. Hanging upside down turned the victim into an object of ridicule. Passing crowds would laugh, spit, and mock as the helpless figure twitched and gasped above them, like a broken, twisted statue of failure. Perhaps the most famous case was Saint Peter, who, according to tradition, chose to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die like Christ. But in many cases, the condemned had no choice at all. They were simply flipped and left to suffer, their death turned into a horrifying joke that echoed through the cruel streets of Rome. In the end, upside-down crucifixion wasn't only death. It was a final, ruthless reminder from Rome. Not only will we kill you, we will make you into a spectacle. Poena Cullei, the sack of death. In the brutal world of ancient Rome, killing your father or a close family member was considered one of the most disgusting crimes imaginable. But the punishment for this sin was far worse than death. It was pure terror. The Romans invented something special for parricides. It was called Poena Cullei, which means the penalty of the sack. The method was simple, yet horrifying. The condemned person was sewn inside a huge leather sack, still alive. But they weren't alone. Into the sack with them, the Romans threw a terrifying mix of animals. Usually, it was a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster, chosen for their anger, unpredictability, and violent nature. Trapped in the tight, airless sack, surrounded by clawing, biting, and writhing animals, the person was thrown into a river. There was no escape. They could not breathe properly. They could not fight back. Inside the darkness of the sack, they faced two ways to die: torn apart alive by the desperate animals, or drowned slowly as the sack sank deeper and deeper into the cold waters. This wasn't just execution. It was humiliation, terror, and cruelty mixed into one twisted punishment. The Romans believed the murderer had broken the natural order of family, so they sentenced them to die cut off from the human world, in a bag of chaos, swallowed by the river forever. No grave, no honor, no memory, only a forgotten death inside a sack filled with madness. Roman toothpaste. The Romans were obsessed with hygiene and appearances. Their cities had public baths, clean streets, and grooming rituals. But hidden beneath this image of cleanliness was something disgusting. For whiter teeth, Romans used a very special ingredient: urine. Collected from public urinals and even imported from far away, urine was prized for its ammonia, a natural cleaning agent. It was mixed into tooth-cleaning powders and mouth rinses. Wealthy and poor alike rubbed this foul mixture onto their teeth, believing it would make their smiles shine. Worse still, they didn't just use animal urine. Human urine was considered even better, as it was fresher and more potent. People paid good money for it, and traders sold large pots of collected urine in markets. Every morning, Romans began their day scrubbing their teeth and rinsing their mouths with what others had discarded as filth. To them, it was normal, even fashionable. But beneath the polished smiles was a horrifying truth. Rome's beauty came with the taste of rot and waste, proof that even in the grandest empire, dignity was easily sacrificed for vanity. The Fork of Heretics. Not all deaths in ancient times came quickly. Some were designed to stretch out suffering, forcing victims to die slowly while fully awake, fully aware. One of the most terrifying methods was the use of the Fork of Heretics, a cruel metal device crafted with terrifying simplicity. It was a two-pronged iron fork, sharp and unforgiving, strapped tightly to the underside of the victim's chin and the top of their chest, or between their neck and chest and chin and jaw. Once locked in place, the victim could do only one thing: stay perfectly still or die horribly. Speaking: impossible. Lowering the head from exhaustion: fatal. Sleeping: unthinkable. The prongs were positioned so any movement, even the natural dropping of the head from fatigue, would cause them to pierce into soft flesh, tearing open arteries or forcing the victim to choke on their own blood. Victims were left in this agonizing position for hours or days. Death did not come fast. Instead, it crept in slowly, as sleep deprivation, thirst, and exhaustion broke down the body and mind. Most victims died not from the forks themselves, but from the cruel torture of being unable to rest. The Fork of Heretics was not just a tool of death. It was a weapon of silence. Used mainly on those accused of heresy, it prevented them from speaking out, from preaching, defending themselves, or even begging for mercy. In the end, they died as they lived under punishment, silenced, broken, and utterly alone, their last moments spent battling their own body's desperate need for rest and losing. Lupercalia. Before Valentine's Day, there was Lupercalia, and it wasn't about love. It was about blood, violence, and ancient fears hidden beneath Rome's civilized face. Every year, on February 15th, Roman priests known as Luperci gathered in the sacred cave of Lupercalia, where legend said Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, were raised by a wolf. But what followed was anything but noble. The ritual began with the sacrifice of goats and dogs. These animals, seen as symbols of fertility and protection, were slaughtered without mercy. Their warm blood was caught in bowls as the priests stood, naked except for loincloths made from the animals' own skins. Then came the blood smearing, one of the most chilling parts of Lupercalia. Using bloody knives, the priests smeared the fresh blood across each other's foreheads, marking themselves in crimson as chants and laughter filled the cold winter air. But it wasn't over. The blood was then wiped away, not with water, but with milk-soaked wool. This strange act symbolized purification and rebirth, mixing life and death in a twisted dance of ritual power. After the smearing, the blood-soaked priests ran wildly through the streets, whipping women with strips of goat hide. Strangely, women welcomed the strikes, believing they would bring fertility and ease childbirth. What looked like madness to outsiders was sacred to Rome. Blood, death, and violence were seen as keys to life itself. Lupercalia wasn't about flowers and affection. It was about ancient instincts, where blood smeared on the skin and pain in the streets were offerings to gods older than love itself. Roman baby dumping. In the Grand Empire of Rome, where laws were strict and glory was everything, not all lives were seen as valuable. Among the darkest and most heartless traditions was a practice called exposure, the brutal abandonment of newborn babies deemed unworthy of life. The decision was terrifyingly simple. When a baby was born, it was placed at the feet of the father. If he lifted the child, it was accepted into the family. But if he turned his back, that baby was sentenced to die. Unwanted babies, often girls, the disabled, or children from affairs, were taken far from home. Left in marketplaces, on garbage heaps, or abandoned on hills, they were exposed to the cruelest executioner of all, nature itself, the cold of the night, the scorching sun, hunger, thirst, and predators. Alone and helpless, the infants cried until they couldn't anymore. Some would last hours, others, days. And yet, death wasn't always the worst fate. Slavers searched these dumping grounds, taking surviving infants to be raised as slaves, prostitutes, or fighters. Instead of dying young, they would live lives of endless suffering. No names, no graves, no legacy. These children became forgotten shadows, erased from Roman memory as if they never existed. In a city that worshipped strength and power, weakness was thrown away like trash. In Rome, life only mattered if someone wanted you to live. Tongue removal. In Rome, words could be dangerous. A simple sentence against the emperor, a whisper of rebellion, even poetry that mocked power, all could seal your fate. But death was not always the punishment. Sometimes, the Romans preferred something worse, complete and permanent silence. Tongue removal was one of the cruelest punishments they used to make sure no words would ever leave your mouth again. The process was brutal. There was no anesthesia. Victims were tied down, their mouths pried open with iron tools. Sharp hooks or pincers would seize the tongue, pulling it out until it stretched unnaturally long. Then, with a blade, it would be sliced off right at the root. The pain was beyond words. Blood poured freely, choking the victim as they screamed in agony. Their final scream. Infection was almost guaranteed. Many died days later from shock or rot, their mouths swollen and full of pus. But for those who lived, survival was no mercy. They were left disfigured, unable to speak, beg, or defend themselves ever again. To society, they became ghosts, silent, drooling, humiliated. Rome did this on purpose. Killing someone erases them, but removing their tongue erases their power while forcing them to exist and suffer. Rebels, traitors, and outspoken enemies were turned into living warnings. Speak against Rome, and your voice will be taken forever. Tarpeian Rock high above the Roman Forum, where the city bustled with life, stood a silent and merciless executioner, Tarpeian Rock. To many, it was just a cliff, but to Rome, it was something far more terrifying, the place where traitors took their final fall. This jagged stone ledge, steep and unforgiving, became the empire's favorite punishment for the most hated of all criminals, those who betrayed Rome itself. Spies, rebels, corrupt officials, or soldiers who turned against their brothers. They all faced the same fate. There were no last words, no glorious battles, no heroic ends. Instead, the condemned were dragged through the streets in shame. Crowds gathered not to weep, but to jeer and celebrate. When they reached the summit, guards offered no ceremony. The guilty were simply thrown. Falling wasn't instant death. The drop from Tarpeian Rock was high enough to break bones, crack skulls, and shatter bodies, but not always to kill outright. Many victims landed broken and bleeding, still conscious, gasping in agony as the crowd looked on. Some died instantly. Others lay in twisted, horrifying positions until death slowly took them. To Rome, this was not just about execution. It was about erasing honor. Being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock marked someone as the lowest of the low, traitors not worthy of a sword, a grave, or even respect. Their bodies were often left where they fell, rotting in the sun as a reminder to every citizen. Betray Rome, and this is where you will land. In a city that prized loyalty and strength, Tarpeian Rock became more than stone. It became a silent judge, cold, unmoved, and always hungry for the next body to break. Gladiator Blood. The Roman crowds cheered as swords clashed and blood splattered across the sand. To most, gladiators were simply entertainment, warriors who lived and died for the crowd's pleasure. But for some, they were something much more sinister. In the twisted beliefs of ancient Rome, the blood of a gladiator was seen as powerful, sacred even. Doctors, mystics, and desperate citizens thought this blood held life-changing properties. They believed it could cure epilepsy, transfer strength, and even heal sickness of the mind. When a gladiator fell, twitching in his final moments, people rushed to collect the warm, fresh blood straight from the body. Some drank it immediately, swallowing the iron-rich liquid before it cooled. Others mixed it into potions and remedies, desperate to absorb the fallen warrior's vitality. But this wasn't just about health. it was about stealing life itself. Romans believed the raw energy of battle, the fear, rage, and adrenaline lived inside the blood. Drinking it was seen as a way to capture that primal force, taking it from the dead before their spirit vanished forever. It didn't stop at blood. Some even harvested the livers of dead gladiators, turning them into disgusting cures or rituals believed to protect against evil and illness. In truth, gladiator blood cured nothing. But fear and desperation can twist minds. To the sick and the broken, swallowing blood felt like a chance, no matter how dark or horrifying. In Rome, strength was everything, and when men fell on the sands, their bodies became trophies, not just for the victors, but for the twisted hopes of a city that would drink death itself in search of power. Nailed alive. To die quickly was a mercy, but in ancient Rome, mercy was rare. When the empire truly wanted someone to suffer, when they wanted the world to see pain stretched to its very limits, they turned to a punishment as simple as it was horrifying, being nailed alive. This was no execution. It was a message. Victims were not killed instantly. Instead, heavy iron nails were driven through their hands, feet, and sometimes even knees and elbows, pinning them to walls, wooden posts, or trees. But here was the true cruelty. They were left there, alive. The goal wasn't death. Not yet. It was suffering. Hanging helpless, the victim could not move without tearing their own flesh. Every slight shift caused agonizing pain as the weight of their own body ripped against the unyielding nails. Blood poured slowly, but not fast enough to bring release. Some were nailed in public places, left to rot in the sun, swarmed by flies and mocked by passers-by. Birds would land, pecking at their open wounds. Thirst and hunger gnawed away at them. For hours, sometimes days, they hung between life and death, their minds breaking long before their bodies did. Eventually, infection, shock, or pure exhaustion would take them. By the time death arrived, it was no longer punishment. It was mercy. Nailed alive was a punishment reserved for those Rome wanted, erased slowly. Rebels, runaway slaves, and enemies of the state. They were not granted quick deaths or proper burials. Instead, they became living warnings, nailed in place as their last breath slipped away, inch by agonizing inch. A reminder to all that Rome's justice was merciless and patient. Sewn into animal skins. Rome was famous for its brutal executions, but few punishments were as humiliating and terrifying as being sewn into animal skins and left to die. This fate was often reserved for criminals, traitors, or those considered dangerous to society. After sentencing, the victim was stripped naked and tightly sewn inside the hide of a dead animal, usually a donkey, ox, or even a lion. Trapped in the suffocating darkness, the person could barely move or breathe. But the horror was only beginning. The bloody, rotting skin attracted the attention of Rome's hungriest predators. Abandoned in the wild or thrown into arenas, they became living bait. Dogs, wolves, and wild beasts, driven mad by the scent of fresh blood, would rip through the hide, tearing into the flesh of the helpless victim trapped inside. For hours, sometimes longer, the person endured agony as animals tore them apart bit by bit. They couldn't escape, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't even scream properly through the thick hide suffocating them. This wasn't just execution. It was mockery and torture wrapped into one. Rome wanted them to suffer, to feel themselves being devoured while still alive, until the final bite ended their nightmare. In the empire of order and law, even death could become twisted into something far worse, a cruel game for beasts and spectators alike. Death by beasts. In the heart of Rome, death wasn't always private or silent. Sometimes it was turned into a spectacle, a brutal show where humans became prey in front of roaring crowds. In grand arenas like the Colosseum, criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state were often sentenced to a horrifying fate known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It didn't matter who you were. Once sentenced, your name was erased and you were reduced to something simple: meat. On the day of execution, victims were dragged into the arena, terrified, unarmed, and exposed. Around them, tens of thousands of Romans cheered and laughed, ready to watch horror unfold. Then the gates opened. Lions, tigers, bears, and packs of starving dogs, kept without food for days, were released. There was no mercy, no hope of survival. The animals lunged instantly, ripping flesh, snapping bones, and dragging victims across the bloody sand. Some tried to run, some begged, some fought with their bare hands. None succeeded. Death came slowly and brutally. Sometimes, the beasts played with their prey before killing them. Other times, poorly trained animals ignored the victims, forcing guards to stab or whip them into a frenzy, just to make sure the crowd got the bloody show they demanded. By the end, what was left was barely human: torn bodies, scattered limbs, and silence as the crowd moved on to the next event without care. In Rome, this was not called cruelty. It was entertainment. For the victims, it was a nightmare. For the empire, it was just another day at the games. Death by wagons. One of the cruelest punishments was being tied to a wagon or chariot and dragged through the rough, merciless roads of the city until death. This was a punishment for traitors, rebels, and those seen as enemies of the people. The victim's hands, legs, or even neck were tightly bound to the back of a heavy wagon. Once tied up, there was no turning back. The driver would whip the horses or oxen, and the cart would lurch forward, pulling the helpless victim face first across sharp stones, dirt, and broken debris scattered across the streets. Every bump and turn tore flesh from bone. Skin shredded, teeth shattered, bones cracked. The body became unrecognizable fast, but death didn't come immediately. Many remained alive far longer than they should have, screaming in agony as their bodies were slowly ripped apart by the relentless journey. Sometimes they were dragged through the Forum, Rome's busiest center, as crowds gathered to laugh, spit, and throw rocks at the broken and bleeding figure tied behind the wagon. It was not just death. It was humiliation, torture, and execution, blended into one endless nightmare. The broken corpse was often left at the city gates, or thrown into rivers to rot. There was no honor, no burial, no last words. Being dragged to death by wagon wasn't just punishment. It was a message burned into the minds of every Roman. This is what happens when you turn against Rome. The earth itself will break you. Slave-breeding farms. In the brutal machine that was the Roman Empire, slaves were fuel. They built the roads, served the nobles, fought in the arenas, and filled every corner of daily life. But there was a problem. Wars didn't last forever, and as conquests slowed, so did the supply of new slaves. Rome, however, had no intention of slowing down. To solve this, they turned to something even darker: slave-breeding farms. In hidden estates across the empire, slaves were forced to breed like animals. Owners paired them together, not out of love, but for profit. The stronger and healthier the slaves, the more valuable their offspring would be. Families were torn apart, emotions erased. The slaves became no more than a renewable resource, expected to reproduce and create the next generation of laborers. Some were promised better treatment for producing more children. Others were beaten or starved into submission if they refused. There was no dignity, no rights, just endless cycles of forced reproduction and suffering. Children born into these farms were born into chains. They never knew freedom, only work and obedience. From the moment they could walk, they were put to labor, serving the empire that saw them not as people, but as property. In Rome's eyes, this was practical. To historians and humanity, it is horrifying. Behind the glory of Roman marble and empire were fields not of grain, but of people, grown, harvested, and sold like cattle, in a system where life itself was just another product. Feeding prisoners to lampreys. Rome was filled with brutal punishments, but some weren't just about killing. They were about making death a performance. One of the cruelest, and perhaps most twisted punishments, was reserved not for common criminals, but sometimes for servants and slaves who angered powerful elites. Feeding prisoners to lampreys. Lampreys were monstrous in their own right. Long, snake-like creatures with circular, jawless mouths filled with sharp, spiraling teeth. They were not like other fish. They were parasites, built to latch onto prey and tear flesh slowly as they drained the life from them. In lavish villas of the Roman elite, some kept private pools filled with these deadly creatures, not for beauty, not for farming, but for punishment. If a servant disobeyed, broke something valuable, or offended their master, they could face a fate worse than death. Stripped and bound, the condemned would be thrown alive into the water. There was no escape. The lampreys, starved to heighten their bloodlust, would swarm instantly. Death did not come quickly. The lampreys latched on, boring into skin, ripping chunks of flesh away slowly and methodically. Victims thrashed and screamed as they were literally eaten alive by endless tiny mouths, each bite another reminder that this was no normal execution. This was vengeance turned into horror. It was said that one wealthy Roman, Vedius Pollio, became infamous for using lampreys to kill his slaves for the smallest mistakes. Even some emperors were disgusted by such cruelty. Yet it happened, quietly accepted in private estates, where the powerful ruled without mercy. In Rome, even death could be creative. And when the masters wished to make an example, they let the lampreys feast. Forced marriages at young ages. In ancient Rome, love was rarely part of marriage. Behind the walls of powerful families and noble houses, marriages were nothing more than strategic moves on a political chessboard. And at the center of this brutal game were children, especially young girls, who had no say in the matter. By law and custom, girls could be married off as soon as they reached the age of 12. For many Roman fathers, this wasn't early, it was practical. Daughters were seen not as people with dreams or feelings, but as valuable assets, ready to secure alliances, strengthen family ties, or increase wealth. A girl could wake up in her father's home, surrounded by familiar walls and family, only to be told that the next day she would belong to another man. Often, that man was much older, already established in life, and seeking a wife who could bear children and run his household. Whether the girl was ready, emotionally, physically, or mentally, didn't matter. Her duty was simple: obey and produce heirs. These marriages were arranged far in advance. Deals were made in dining halls and whispered conversations, where fathers promised their daughters to friends, allies, or even political rivals, hoping to turn enemies into family. For boys, marriage was also arranged, though they usually married later. But for girls, time was not a luxury. Their value, in the eyes of Roman society, peaked early. The wedding itself was filled with ceremony and tradition. But beneath the flowers and music was cold reality. A child was being sent away, often to a stranger's house, to fulfill a role she never chose. There, life was strict and demanding. She would be expected to bear children while still little more than a child herself. Her opinions didn't matter. Her comfort was irrelevant. She belonged to her husband now, bound by law and culture. Some were lucky enough to find kindness. Many were not. For Rome, this was not seen as cruelty. It was survival. It was legacy it was tradition. But for the young, forced to leave behind toys and innocence for duty and childbirth, it was something else entirely, a stolen life, traded before it ever truly began. Insane beauty standards. Rome worshipped beauty almost as much as power. Wealthy citizens, especially the elite women, were expected to look flawless at all times, pale skin, smooth faces, perfect hair. But behind this image of grace and perfection was a hidden horror. Beauty in Rome was deadly. To achieve that ghostly white skin, Roman women smeared their faces daily with powders made from white lead. It wasn't just toxic, it was lethal. Every application poisoned their skin and blood. Over time, it caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, rotting teeth, and eventually, death. But they kept applying it. Because pale skin was seen as noble, a sign that you did not work outdoors like the poor. Eyes were darkened with kohl, which often contained dangerous heavy metals. Cheeks were reddened using mixtures of rust and vinegar, irritating the skin and leaving burns beneath the makeup. Hair was bleached with harsh chemicals and even urine, stripping it until it became dry, brittle, and unhealthy. Wigs made from slave hair, often taken from conquered peoples, were worn proudly, turning war trophies into fashion statements. Men were not excluded. Wealthy Roman men also used lead-based creams to smooth wrinkles and erase blemishes, slowly poisoning themselves in the process, all in pursuit of youthful appearances. The irony was cruel. In trying to look healthy, radiant, and noble, they were slowly killing themselves every single day. But vanity ruled Rome. Appearance mattered more than invisible sickness. The rich smiled with rotting teeth and covered sores as they sipped poisoned wine from lead cups, never questioning if beauty was worth the cost. In Rome, beauty wasn't skin deep. It ran deep into the veins, where poison whispered quietly, day after day, until death finally came wearing a flawless mask. Burial. Alive Rome was a world built on power, discipline, and loyalty. To betray that foundation, even with words, was not just dishonorable, it was unforgivable. Oaths in Rome were sacred. They weren't casual promises. They were binding contracts with the gods themselves. Soldiers swore them. Vestal virgins swore them. Politicians, priests, and common citizens alike, all bound by their word. But when oaths were broken, Rome didn't just punish. It made examples. The punishment for betrayal wasn't a swift sword or public humiliation. No, for some, it was something far more terrifying and final, being buried alive. This was most famously practiced with the Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to remain pure and protect the sacred fire of Rome. If one was found to have broken her vow of chastity, the sentence was chilling. No blood could be spilled, for spilling a Vestal's blood was sacrilege. Instead, she was led through the silent streets of Rome, dressed in funeral robes, while the people watched in horrified reverence. She was placed into a dark underground chamber, a small suffocating cell beneath the earth. A tiny amount of food and water was given, not out of mercy, but to mock the process, so that death would come slowly, in complete darkness and isolation. No prayers, no visitors, no voice to scream, just endless silence as the earth became her coffin. She would sit, wait, and feel life drain away, buried alive for breaking the unbreakable. But Vestals weren't the only ones. In rare, extreme cases, others who betrayed Rome or its gods were also sentenced to this unspeakable fate. The earth itself was seen as judge and executioner, swallowing those who had broken trust with their city and gods. In Rome, betrayal was not met with forgiveness. It was met with dirt, darkness, and the slow, maddening suffocation of being forgotten beneath the very world you once walked. Urine as everyday soap. To the Romans, cleanliness was everything. Public baths were everywhere, and wealthy citizens took pride in spotless homes and polished appearances. But beneath the surface of this obsession was a disturbing truth. Rome was washed in urine. Urine wasn't waste to them. It was useful. Full of ammonia, it made an excellent cleaning agent. Clothes were scrubbed with it at the Pholoniki, large laundry facilities where slaves and workers stomped on garments in tubs filled with human and animal urine. The smell was overpowering. The process was filthy, but it worked. It didn't stop with clothes. Some Romans even used urine as mouthwash, believing it whitened teeth and killed bacteria. Imported urine from places like Portugal was considered particularly strong and valuable. And yes, it was taxed, just like precious goods. To outsiders, this sounds horrifying. To Rome, it was practical. Waste became tool. Disgust became routine. But imagine the contradiction. The same people who gathered in grand marble bathhouses to discuss philosophy and politics were rubbing urine-soaked fabrics against their skin or swishing it between their teeth hours earlier. In Rome, cleanliness didn't mean purity. It meant survival and utility, even if it reeked of rot and waste. Behind the marble statues and silk togas, there was always the smell of ammonia, clinging quietly to the empire's pride. Public baths Rome prided itself on its baths. These public spaces were more than places to wash. They were the heart of daily life. Rich and poor alike gathered there to socialize, gossip, relax, and cleanse their bodies. But beneath the steam and marble lurked something horrifying. Parasites and disease thrived in Rome's sacred bathhouses. Thousands used the same waters daily. Sweat, dirt, urine, and even feces mixed into the warm pools, creating the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Soap, as we know it today, was rare. Instead, Romans scraped their skin with strigils, metal tools that removed dirt and oils. But often, this only stirred up the filth, spreading germs from person to person. Worst of all, the bathers went from hot pools to cold ones without proper cleansing. Skin pores, opened by heat, became perfect gateways for parasites, fungi, and bacteria. Eye infections, skin diseases, intestinal parasites, and deadly fevers circulated silently, passed along with friendly conversation and laughter. Even the drinking fountains inside the baths weren't safe. Fed by the same plumbing systems exposed to waste, they often delivered tainted water directly into thirsty mouths. What was meant to cleanse actually corrupted, but no one stopped. Cleanliness was tied to status. Not bathing meant being poor and dirty. Romans continued to gather, swim, and scrape, unknowingly poisoning each other every single day. In Rome, the baths were a symbol of civilization, but in truth, they were quiet, bubbling cauldrons of sickness, slowly infecting the very people who worshipped cleanliness above all else. Sewers overflowing into drinking water. Rome prided itself on its brilliant engineering. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's oldest sewer systems, was a marvel, designed to carry waste far away from the city. Clean aqueducts brought fresh water into homes, baths, and fountains. But beneath this genius, something horrifying brewed. As the empire grew, so did its filth. The sewers, clogged with human waste, animal carcasses, and street garbage, couldn't always handle the load. During heavy rains, festivals, or poor maintenance, the unthinkable happened. The sewers overflowed. When this happened, dirty water didn't stay underground. It backed up through drains, flooded bathhouses, and worst of all, seeped into the very aqueducts and cisterns that supplied drinking water to the entire city. The result? Rome drank from poisoned cups. Invisible to the eye, this contaminated water spread sickness fast. Typhoid, dysentery, and other deadly diseases silently infected rich and poor alike. Romans believed in the purity of their aqueducts, yet every sip became a gamble. They bathed, cooked, and drank in ignorance, while deadly bacteria thrived. What's worse, this cycle repeated year after year. The empire's pride became its curse. The brilliant aqueducts and sewers, once symbols of civilization, had turned into hidden highways for death. In the heart of mighty Rome, it wasn't always war or violence that claimed lives. Sometimes, death flowed quietly, through the very water meant to keep the empire alive. Roman lie detection. In ancient Rome, truth wasn't always sought through reason. There were no lie detectors, no advanced technology, but there was something just as terrifying: fear and brutality. When suspicion arose, whether about a thief, traitor, or unfaithful spouse, the Romans turned to methods far darker than questions and answers. They believed that when pain, humiliation, or divine fear were applied, lies would burn away and truth would surface. One of the simplest methods was the oath before the gods. The accused would swear publicly in front of altars and statues. Romans believed lying before the gods invited instant misfortune or divine punishment. Many confessed out of pure terror, not of human justice, but of heavenly wrath. But when that wasn't enough, interrogation became physical. Torture was a legal tool, especially for slaves and the lower classes. Twisting limbs, burning flesh, and relentless beatings weren't just punishments. They were ways to force the truth from unwilling lips. Under unbearable pain, almost anyone would speak. Romans accepted this not as cruelty, but as proof that pain made lying impossible. Another brutal custom was the use of public humiliation. Being stripped, whipped, or paraded through the streets broke the spirit. In such shame, many would confess anything to make the suffering stop. For serious accusations, especially treason, interrogations could last for days, until exhaustion, starvation, and endless questioning left the accused delirious and desperate. Lies melted away as sanity slipped through trembling fingers. To Rome, the body was the lie detector. When pushed hard enough, it would betray secrets hidden deep inside. But in truth, it was far from reliable. Many innocent people confessed simply to end the torment, staining their names and lives forever. In the empire of law and order, truth was often written in bruises, blood, and broken cries beneath marble walls. Christianity in Rome. In the mighty empire of Rome, religion was everywhere. Temples rose high, sacrifices fed the gods, and emperors demanded worship as divine rulers. To deny this system wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. So when Christianity appeared, quiet and small, preaching of a single God and rejecting Rome's pantheon, the empire did not tolerate it. At first, Christians were seen as outcasts. They met in secret, in homes, in catacombs beneath the earth, whispering prayers and hiding from public view. But as their numbers grew, so did Rome's fear and hatred. They refused to worship the emperor. They refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. They refused to blend into Roman society. This wasn't seen as faith. It was seen as rebellion, treason. And Rome crushed rebellion without mercy. Christians were arrested, tortured, and forced to swear loyalty to Rome's gods or face death. Many refused. These defiant believers faced unspeakable punishments. Burned alive, their bodies turned to ash in public squares. Torn apart by wild beasts in the arenas as crowds cheered. Crucified in mass executions, their bodies lining the roads as warnings. Buried alive or thrown into prisons, forgotten in the dark. But the persecutions did not erase them. Each death became a martyrdom. Each cry in the arena became a whisper that spread through the streets and homes. Rome could kill bodies, but it couldn't kill faith. In time, the unthinkable happened. The empire that once bathed in Christian blood converted to Christianity itself. By the 4th century, under Emperor Constantine, the cross replaced the eagle, and churches rose where temples once stood. The persecuted became the powerful. The hunted became the rulers. In Rome, Christianity was once punished by fire, but eventually it burned through the empire until nothing else remained. Nero's cruelty to pregnant women. Rome had seen cruel emperors. It had suffered under tyrants, madmen, and butchers. But Nero stood alone. Known for his paranoia, sadism, and thirst for power, Nero's reign became a nightmare for the innocent. But his darkest cruelty wasn't always public. Sometimes it happened behind palace doors, where the weak and helpless became his favorite victims. Pregnant women were not spared. History whispers terrible stories about Nero's brutal whims. If he felt insulted, betrayed, or simply amused, he unleashed horrors even the empire found difficult to speak of. Some sources claim Nero took twisted pleasure in ordering the brutal killing of pregnant women, not just enemies, but women of the palace and nobility who had fallen out of his favor. To him, pregnancy was no shield. In fact, it made his cruelty even more monstrous. The unborn, innocent, and defenseless became part of his brutal spectacles. In the empire where heirs were prized, Nero saw only opportunities for violence. Even his own wife, Poppaea Sabina, wasn't safe. Ancient historians say Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her violently while she was pregnant, leading to her death and the death of their unborn child. Though some stories are debated, the message in Roman memory was clear. Nero's rage and ego knew no limits. In his world, no one was sacred, not the weak, not the unborn, not even those carrying the future of Rome inside them. Nero ruled with fire, blood, and madness. And when his empire fell silent at night, it whispered of women who died carrying life, stolen not by fate, but by the hands of an emperor who saw mercy as weakness. Selling dead gladiators. In Rome, gladiators were celebrated as warriors. They fought for honor, for glory, and for survival. But when they fell, when their blood soaked into the sands and their bodies grew cold, Rome did not mourn. It sold them. To the crowds, a gladiator's death was a fleeting thrill. Cheers erupted. Bets were won or lost. And when the corpse was dragged from the arena, most looked away, already hungry for the next battle. But behind the scenes, a darker economy thrived. The bodies of dead gladiators became valuable commodities. Vendors, physicians, and opportunists knew that these fallen men, still fresh from battle, could be harvested and sold to the desperate and the superstitious. Blood was bottled, sold to those who believed drinking it could cure epilepsy or transfer bravery. Flesh and organs were sometimes secretly sold for illegal rituals or dark magical practices. Bones and ashes were taken by collectors, believed to hold strength and spiritual power. Even the weapons and armor they once held became trophies, sold to nobles who wished to display the tools of death in their villas as grim conversation pieces. In some cases, gladiators were denied proper burials. Their bodies were discarded like trash, only to be scavenged later and sold part by part. Their identities erased, their sacrifices forgotten. In Rome, death was not the end of the fight. Even in silence, the gladiators were sold one last time, piece by piece, until nothing remained but whispers and empty sand. To the empire, they were never heroes. They were resources. Alive, they entertained. Dead, they still paid. Minor insults. In Rome, swords and shields ruled the battlefield. But on the streets, words were just as deadly. Honor and reputation were everything. To insult a Roman, even with something as small as a joke, a careless word, or an accidental slight, could spark disaster. Minor insults weren't treated as harmless. They were taken as attacks on dignity. And in a society obsessed with status and pride, attacks on dignity demanded revenge. Among equals, a small insult could spiral into a duel or public challenge. Senators, nobles, and soldiers alike would risk death just to defend their reputation. Refusing to respond could make you look weak, something no Roman could afford. For slaves and the poor, insulting their masters or betters, even in private, carried horrifying punishments. Whispers, rumors, or casual complaints could lead to floggings, mutilation, or worse. Roman law gave masters near total control. If a slave dared insult or disrespect, execution was always on the table. Among emperors and the elite, insults became even more dangerous. Calling the emperor a fool, even in jest, was treated as treason. Under paranoid rulers like Caligula or Nero, spies listened everywhere. A single slip of the tongue could see you dragged away, tortured, and executed without trial. Even in public, insults could spark riots and mob violence. Rival factions in the arena hurled insults that turned deadly, with people beaten or murdered over shouted words tied to loyalty and pride. In Rome, insults weren't words, they were weapons. And in a world ruled by power and ego, weapons always drew blood. Silence became survival. Speaking out became a gamble. And for many, the wrong word at the wrong time became the last thing they ever said. Suffocation by smoke. Among the empire's lesser-known but horrifying punishments was death by smoke suffocation. A punishment that didn't spill blood, but instead stole breath, sanity, and life inch by inch. Smoke was Rome's silent killer. Unlike fire, it didn't burn, it didn't make a spectacle. It crept, invisible and choking, into the lungs, turning each breath into agony. For crimes that didn't warrant the arena or public crucifixion, like theft, betrayal, or disgraceful conduct, smoke suffocation was sometimes used. Victims were sealed in small, airtight rooms or containers. There, fires or smouldering dung were lit beneath them, creating thick, noxious smoke that slowly filled every corner. At first they coughed and gasped. Their eyes burned, throats closed, and panic set in as oxygen disappeared. But death didn't come quickly. It came slowly. Minutes stretched into unbearable eternities as the body convulsed, the lungs filled with poison, and consciousness slipped away in terror. Victims collapsed, their final moments spent clawing at walls and begging for air that would never come. To Rome, this method had a cruel beauty. There was no blood to clean, no crowds to feed, just quiet death, hidden from view, forgotten by the world. In some cases, smoke suffocation wasn't used as execution, but as torture. Prisoners and slaves were subjected to controlled amounts of smoke to break their spirit, extract confessions, or punish them without ending their lives. In Rome, even air could become a weapon, and for those who angered the empire, their last breath was often stolen, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone. Living torches. Rome was a city that thrived in spectacle, battles, feasts, executions, but even in a world soaked in blood, few punishments were as terrifying or as cruel as this, turning human beings into living torches. During the reign of Emperor Nero, this horror became reality. Blaming Christians for a devastating fire that tore through the city, Nero ordered them arrested by the hundreds. But simple execution wasn't enough. He wanted punishment to be slow, public, and unforgettable. So he devised something monstrous. At night, as the Roman elite gathered in his lavish gardens, the condemned were tied to posts. Some were coated in flammable oils and pitch. Others were wrapped tightly in rags and drenched until they dripped. And when the sun set and laughter filled the imperial grounds, the fires were lit. Flames devoured the victims alive, turning their screams into a horrifying symphony of agony. They burned slowly, their bodies acting as grotesque candles, casting flickering light over Nero's parties and games. To Nero, they were decorations. To Rome, they were warnings. To themselves, they were nothing but fuel. The guests, drunk and entertained, watched beneath garlands and music as human beings were reduced to blackened bone and ash, their final moments spent not in dignity, but in unimaginable pain. Nero called it justice. Others called it madness. But in the end, history remembers this cruelty with one name: living torches. Rome, in those nights, wasn't lit by glory or greatness. It was lit by the burning bodies of the innocent, their light stretching into eternity as a stain on the empire's soul. Massacre of prisoners of war. Rome respected strength. Rome admired victory. But Rome had no mercy for the defeated. For soldiers captured on the battlefield, surrender did not always mean survival. In many cases, it meant something much worse: becoming part of a gruesome tradition where life became worthless and death became a message. Prisoners of war were not always seen as worthy captives. They were enemies, threats, symbols of defiance against Roman power. And in times of anger or warning, Rome made examples of them, not through chains, but through slaughter. Mass executions were not rare. After great battles, thousands of captured soldiers were lined up, stripped of weapons, and slaughtered en masse, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. Some were taken into arenas, fed to wild beasts, or forced to fight to the death purely for public amusement. Others were beheaded, crucified, or hacked to pieces in front of laughing Roman citizens, celebrating their empire's glory. Even generals who surrendered honorably were not safe. Entire units could be wiped out to show nearby tribes, kingdoms, and rebellious provinces what Roman justice looked like. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about domination. Mercy was weakness. Slaughter was policy. Perhaps the darkest example came after the Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal wiped out a Roman army. Rome, humiliated, refused to ransom its captured soldiers. They were labeled cowards, many condemned to die in exile or sold into brutal slavery, forgotten forever. For Rome, prisoners were only valuable if they could entertain, build, or serve. When they couldn't, they became dust on the empire's boots. In Rome, surrender did not always save you. Sometimes it simply lined you up, to be counted, executed, and erased from history with ruthless efficiency. Suicide pacts among nobles. In Rome, death was never simply the end of life. It was part of a performance, a final, silent speech in the brutal language of power, reputation, and legacy. For the nobles, senators, and elites of the empire, death came not only with swords and assassins, but in the form of accusations whispered in dark corners and imperial orders that offered no chance to argue. Falling out of favor was not a rare fate. It was a constant threat. One day you were seated at the emperor's side. The next, you were marked for disgrace or death. But Rome was obsessed with dignity, and for those who held titles and wealth, public execution was not merely a punishment. It was humiliation carved into history forever. To be dragged through the streets, to be slaughtered like a common criminal, to be remembered as a disgrace, was often worse than death itself. And so they chose a different path, not offered freely, but forced upon them by the cruel customs of Roman honor. Suicide, in this world, became the last defense against shame. It was not cowardice, it was ritual. By taking their own lives, nobles could shield their families from disgrace, preserve their estates, and write the final chapter of their stories on their own terms. But when the blade or poison was prepared, when the end grew near, many could not face this final act alone. This is when something darker and far more chilling emerged in Roman society: suicide pacts. Husbands and wives would take each other's hands, staring not into each other's eyes, but into death itself. Loyal friends, bound by political alliances and years of trust, agreed to perish together rather than watch each other fall. In the cruelest moments, entire families chose to die as one: mothers, fathers, children, locked together in a pact to escape disgrace that Roman society would never forgive. The quiet horror of these pacts echoed through their villas. In darkened rooms lit only by oil lamps, poison was passed from lips already trembling. Veins were opened beside fountains that once sang of life and luxury. Soft words of comfort became final farewells, swallowed by the growing silence of death. Yet even in these terrible endings, Rome found something to praise. To die by your own hand, especially in loyalty to honor and duty, was seen as noble. Poets did not condemn them. They immortalized them. Senators did not pity them. They envied their courage. Rome loved power, but it respected control. And no act proved control more than deciding when, how, and with whom you would die. In Rome, suicide pacts were not only tragedies. They were statements carved in time, declarations that even when stripped of power and targeted by cruelty, nobility would choose death together rather than live dishonored and forgotten. Slave collars. In the bustling streets of ancient Rome, not all chains were heavy, and not all prisons had walls. Some captives walked freely among citizens, carrying not shackles, but something far worse. A mark that reminded them, and everyone around them, that they were not people. They were possessions, slave collars, simple, brutal, inescapable. To be a slave in Rome was to live beneath the weight of invisible chains. Yet for many, those chains were made very real, forged in iron, and locked tightly around their necks. These collars were not designed for fashion, nor comfort. They were meant to brand their wearers forever. For slaves who dared to escape, who tried to reclaim their stolen freedom, punishment was not only swift, but eternal. Upon capture, they would be fitted with heavy iron collars, sometimes so thick and crudely made that they dug into skin and bone. These collars often bore engraved plaques or tags, each carrying a chilling message. I have run away. Capture me. Return me to my master. Hold me. Do not trust me. I belong to master's name. With these words, the slave became more than property. They became a public announcement of shame and failure, reduced to a walking sign begging for recapture. Every street they passed through, every eye that fell upon them, saw not a human being, but a reminder of Rome's harsh laws. Day and night, the collar remained. It did not come off to eat, to sleep, or even to pray. It was constant, a metal whisper around the neck that said, "You are nothing." For some, the collars were a death sentence of the spirit. The physical pain was sharp, but it was the humiliation, the knowledge that even strangers knew you were owned, that broke them slowly. For others, they were a lifelong sentence. Some died with the collar never removed, buried as they lived, bound in iron, forgotten by history. Rome called this control. It was, they believed, necessary to keep the empire running, to maintain order and discipline. But for the slaves who wore them, these collars were more than punishment. They were silent executioners, killing dignity and identity every moment they clung to flesh. In Rome, chains were not always visible. Sometimes they wrapped around the soul, and no key could ever unlock them. Murder games during feasts. In Rome, feasts were more than food. They were power plays. They were theatre. They were reflections of a world where luxury danced hand in hand with cruelty. The elite of Rome gathered in magnificent halls, reclining on silk-covered couches, sipping the finest wines, and surrounded by gold and marble. Their tables overflowed with delicacies brought from every corner of the empire: roasted peacocks, exotic fruits, and rare fish. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and soft music. But beneath the beauty, there was something rotting. For some Roman emperors and nobles, food and drink alone were not enough. They hungered for something more, something darker, something alive. In the grand halls of men like Caligula, feasts sometimes turned into arenas. Slaves, criminals, and unfortunate guests could suddenly find themselves thrust into deadly games, commanded to fight or die for the amusement of the diners. Conversations paused not for speeches, but for screams. Wine glasses were raised in toasts as blades slashed throats only meters away. Blood splattered near fruit platters. Heads rolled before plates were cleared. These were not grand public executions. These were private shows. Intimate, personal, cruel. Guests, bound by fear or ambition, cheered and clapped as men begged for their lives. Some were forced to kill each other with whatever weapons were handed to them: knives, clubs, or bare hands. The only rule was simple: win or die, and either way, entertain. Sometimes these twisted games didn't even involve enemies or criminals. If a guest insulted the host or failed to amuse, they could be condemned on the spot, made part of the night's bloody amusement. No trial, no defense, just sudden, horrifying death before the eyes of those still chewing roasted meat. In Rome, murder could be casual. It could be served alongside honeyed wine and sweet dates. For those who sat at the table, the lesson was clear. Tonight they were guests. Tomorrow they could be entertainment. In the empire of excess, even feasts could become funerals, and laughter could echo over the broken bodies of the forgotten. Executions, without explanation. In Rome, death was not always announced. It did not always come with trumpets, public trials, or grand speeches. Sometimes, it came quietly, unseen, without reason, without mercy. For many, the empire was a world of rules and order. Laws governed every aspect of life, from how you spoke, to whom you married, to where you could stand. But in the shadows of that order lurked something far more terrifying: absolute power. At the highest levels of Roman society, especially during the reign of paranoid emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, or Domitian, the laws could be twisted, ignored, or discarded at a whim. Suspicion itself became a death sentence. Whispers, a glance, a dream someone claimed you spoke aloud. That was all it took. Nobles, senators, generals, powerful figures who dined in marble halls and toasted the emperor's name, often vanished without a single accusation read aloud. Soldiers would arrive in the dead of night. There was no trial, no explanation, no chance to argue. The condemned were given a blade and an order: do it yourself, or we will. Others didn't even get that. Poison slipped into wine. Silent assassins sent to their chambers. Bodies found lifeless before sunrise. Mouths still half open in confusion. For those left behind, the horror was just as deep. Families were forbidden from mourning publicly. Names were erased from records. The executed became ghosts in Roman memory, gone as if they had never existed. Why were they killed? No one dared ask. To question was to risk joining them. In time, citizens learned the terrible truth of imperial Rome. You could live a life of loyalty, service, and honor, yet vanish in a heartbeat, condemned by nothing more than fear or imperial whim. In Rome, justice was not always blind. Sometimes it simply didn't care to explain itself. Communal sponge on a stick. Rome loved to believe it was clean. Its aqueducts delivered crystal clear water. Its bathhouses gleamed in the sunlight. Its citizens paraded through marble streets, wrapped in spotless togas. But beneath that image of purity was filth, not hidden, not accidental, deliberate, routine, accepted. In the crowded public toilets of ancient Rome, dark, echoing spaces filled with rows of stone seats, side by side, no walls, no privacy. There was no toilet paper. There were no personal cloths. Instead, there was something far more disturbing. The communal sponge on a stick. Placed in troughs of water mixed with salt or vinegar, these sponges waited for use by anyone and everyone. One man would finish his business, reach for the stick, and clean himself. Moments later, another would do the same. Then another, and another. Day after day. Dozens of strangers. Hundreds in busy cities. There was no shame in this. No disgust. It was normal. Expected. Even civilized by Roman standards. Yet the truth was far from civilized. The sponges, soaking in dirty, stagnant water, were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Parasites, bacteria, and filth clung to every fiber, turning the simple act of cleaning oneself into a quiet gamble with infection and death. Hemorrhoids, dysentery, and skin infections spread rapidly among the population. The poor, the wealthy, the soldiers and slaves, all equally vulnerable, all equally sharing the same silent threat passed hand to hand, day after day. But none of this stopped Rome. It did not matter if the communal sponge whispered sickness. What mattered was order, tradition, and appearances. Cleanliness was not about hygiene. It was about following ritual, even when ritual meant rubbing yourself with a stranger's disease. In the end, Rome built great cities, conquered distant lands, and created laws that shaped the world. But in its public toilets, beneath the empire's towering greatness, humanity shared something darker. Filth disguised as cleanliness, and danger disguised as routine. Laws applied only to women. In the empire that claimed to civilize the world, where marble halls echoed with speeches of power and justice, there existed silent laws crafted not to guide society, but to suffocate half of it. Laws that did not bind the proud generals, the wealthy senators, or the roaring crowds of men, but instead were forged and sharpened solely for the quiet, controlled existence of women. From the moment a Roman girl drew her first breath, her life was written in rules she did not create and could never change, rules that declared she would pass like property from father to husband, and if fate allowed, from husband to male guardian, never allowed to stand alone in the eyes of the law, always attached, always claimed, always belonging to someone other than herself. While Roman men drank in taverns, debated politics, and took lovers freely without fear or shame, women lived under the crushing weight of pudicitia, forced chastity, expected silence, and the unrelenting demand for modesty so rigid that even glances or gestures could be twisted into accusations that shattered reputations and destroyed lives without mercy or trial. Adultery laws existed not to protect marriages, but to police women's bodies, for while husbands who strayed were met with indulgent shrugs or knowing smiles, wives who dared betray their vows, or were even suspected of doing so, faced exile, disgrace, or death, often at the hands of their own families, who believed honor was better preserved by blood than forgiveness. Even in the quiet moments of daily life, the empire's invisible chains tightened, forbidding women from drinking wine in public, limiting their ability to control property, silencing their voices in political discourse, and ensuring that even in grief and death, their mourning was regulated, their public remembrance restricted, their names fading quietly as Rome's triumphs shouted loudest in the voices of men. Rome may have built wonders and conquered the earth, but in its heart, beneath the marble and gold, it caged every woman within invisible walls made not of stone, but of laws, expectations, and a cruelty so ordinary that even the victims were taught to call it tradition. And that brings us to the end of this deep journey into the dark and disturbing truths hidden within ancient Rome. It's truly fascinating and terrifying to realize how far humanity has come, yet how much darkness still lingers in the stories of the past. These tales aren't just facts, They're echoes of real lives, real pain, and real power struggles that shaped our world in ways we rarely stop to think about. If you enjoyed unraveling these hidden layers of history, please leave a like. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference in helping this content reach more curious minds out there. And if you're passionate about diving into forgotten stories and shocking truths, make sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, and this is only the beginning. I truly appreciate you staying until the very end. You're the kind of viewer who loves going beyond the surface, and that's exactly who this channel is for. Stay curious, stay sharp, never stop questioning what lies beneath the pages of history. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.